When I arrived at my sister's wedding and gave my name, the woman at the reception table frowned like she thought she had misheard me. Could you say that again? Myra Wells, I said. I'm the bride's sister. She ran her finger down the guest list once, then again, slower this time. Another woman leaned over to help. I stood there with a small silver gift box in both hands, my palms damp against the ribbon, while the music from the ballroom drifted into the lobby behind them. Laughter, glasses clinking, a string quartet somewhere farther inside. The first woman looked up at me with that careful, embarrassed expression people wear when they're about to confirm something cruel. I'm sorry, ma'am. Your name isn't on the list. For a second, I honestly thought there had been a mistake. Not because Victoria and I were close. We weren't. Not because my family had ever made me feel central to anything. They hadn't. But because there are some humiliations you still don't expect people to arrange so neatly. I asked them to check again. They did. My name still wasn't there. And that was the moment something inside me went very still. Before I tell you what I did next, subscribe and stand for dignity. This story isn't about revenge. It's about the moment you stop asking people to prove you matter. I stepped away from the table and called my sister. She answered on the fourth ring, already irritated. What? I'm at the venue, I said. They're saying I'm not on the guest list. There was a pause, and then she laughed. Not a shocked laugh, not a confused one. A mean one. You really came? She said. Myra, why would you be invited? I don't remember breathing after that. I remember the marble floor under my heels, the cold air in the lobby, the pity on the staff's faces. I flew in from Los Angeles, I said quietly. That sounds like a you problem. Then she hung up. I stood there holding that silver box, and for the first time in my life, I stopped trying to explain my place in this family. I just turned, walked to the gift table, and set the box down. There were hundreds of gifts on that table. Boxes wrapped in glossy paper with gold ribbons, Tiffany blue bags with white tissue, crystal packages big enough to hold wine sets, silver trays, probably things that cost more than the first camera I ever owned. And then there was mine. A small silver box with a white ribbon, simple enough that no one would look at it twice. For a moment, I just stood there. The ballroom doors were open across the lobby. Through them, I could see the beginning of the cocktail hour, waiters passing champagne, guests in expensive suits laughing like everything in the world was exactly where it should be. Somewhere in that room was my sister, Victoria Wells, the bride, the center of everything, like she had always been. I slipped a small card beneath the ribbon. To Victoria. From your sister Myra. Nothing dramatic, nothing bitter, just the truth. If you've ever been in a moment where you knew you could make a scene but chose not to, you understand the strange quiet that settles over you. The receptionist from earlier walked a few steps toward me. Ma'am, she said softly, if you'd like, I could try to call someone for you. I shook my head. No, it's okay. She looked relieved but also confused. You're leaving? Yes. But your gift, it's meant to be opened later. She studied my face like she was trying to understand something she couldn't quite name. Some gifts, I said gently, work better when the person who brought them isn't in the room. She nodded slowly. I took one last look toward the ballroom. Somewhere inside, my parents were probably greeting Marcus's family. My father shaking hands with people whose last names sounded like buildings. My mother smiling at women who measured worth in diamonds and invitations. And Victoria was probably telling someone that her sister hadn't bothered to come. That part almost made me smile. Because tonight, my sister was going to open that silver box. And when she did, the truth she had been living without for years would finally find her. I walked outside into the cold Boston air and called a taxi. As it pulled away from the Grand Belmont Hotel, I checked my phone. 7:42 p.m. The reception would be starting soon. If you're listening to this somewhere in the world right now, tell me where. I always wonder how far stories like this travel. But to understand what was waiting inside that box, we have to go back. Back to the first moment I realized something about my family that would take me years to accept. The day I turned 10 years old. The morning I turned 10, I woke up before the sun. For weeks, I had been counting down the days. 10 felt important, somehow double digits, the beginning of being almost grown. Victoria had thrown a huge birthday party when she turned 10. There had been ponies in the backyard, a caterer, and 40 kids from her school running through the garden while my parents laughed with the other Beacon Hill families. I didn't expect ponies, but I thought maybe there would be balloons, maybe a cake with my name on it. I ran downstairs in my pajamas. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of my mother talking on the phone. Yes, the caterer confirmed, she was saying. Victoria's cotillion has to be perfect. The guest list is already close to 200. She didn't look up when I walked in. Mom, I said carefully. She held up one finger while still speaking into the phone. I stood there for almost a minute. Finally, she covered the receiver and turned slightly toward me. What is it, sweetheart? It's my birthday. Oh. She blinked like she had just remembered something minor. Right, happy birthday. Then she uncovered the phone and went right back to planning Victoria's event. No balloons appeared that day. No cake. My father left for work before breakfast without mentioning it. Victoria barely glanced up from her cereal. I remember sitting at the kitchen table that afternoon thinking something simple and very confusing for a 10-year-old. Maybe I wasn't the kind of person people celebrated. Anyone who has grown up in a house like that knows the feeling. Not open cruelty, not shouting, just a quiet understanding that you're extra, not the main story. If that feeling ever followed you growing up, say, I understand. You'd be surprised how many people know exactly what that silence feels like. That evening, I was sitting on my bed doing homework when there was a knock on my door. I opened it and found my grandmother standing there. Grandma Eleanor never knocked. She walked in carrying a small wrapped box. Well, she said with a smile that somehow made the whole room warmer, I thought someone in this house should celebrate you. She sat beside me on the bed and handed me the gift. Inside was a camera. Not a toy one. A real one, metal and silver with a leather strap that felt heavy in my hands. You notice things other people miss, she told me softly. That's a rare gift, Myra. I didn't know it yet. But that camera would quietly change the direction of my entire life. The camera was heavier than I expected. When I held it, it felt like something important, like a real responsibility, not just a toy meant to keep a kid busy. The metal was cool in my hands, the leather strap still stiff and new. Do you know how to use it? Grandma Eleanor asked. I shook my head. She smiled. Good, that means you get to learn. That afternoon she showed me everything. How to hold it steady, how to wait before pressing the shutter, how to look at a scene long enough that you could notice the small details other people walked past. Most people look, she said quietly, but very few people see. I carried that camera everywhere after that. I photographed the street outside our Beacon Hill house, the old brick buildings glowing orange at sunset, the neighbor's dog sleeping on the steps, a cracked teacup my mother had left on the kitchen counter. And sometimes, I photographed people, not when they were posing, when they forgot anyone was watching. My grandmother loved those photos. She would sit beside me at the kitchen table, studying each one like it was something precious. You have an artist's eye, she told me more than once. Don't let anyone convince you that what you see doesn't matter. At the time, I didn't understand why she said that so carefully. I would later. Because the rest of my family never once asked about the camera. Not when I started developing photos in the basement. Not when my teachers began encouraging me. Not even years later when I was accepted into one of the best art schools in the country. By the time I turned 18, I had learned something quietly important. Encouragement changes the direction of a life. And silence does too. Some of you listening probably had someone like my grandmother, a teacher, a grandparent, maybe even a stranger who saw something in you before anyone else did. If you did, tell me where you were when that person showed up in your life. Those moments matter more than people realize. 8 years after my 10th birthday, I stood in my bedroom wearing a graduation gown. I had just been accepted to the Rhode Island School of Design with a full scholarship. For the first time in my life, I thought maybe, just maybe, my parents would finally see me. The ceremony started at 2 in the afternoon. I came downstairs around noon, holding the speech I had spent weeks preparing. Victoria was at the kitchen table scrolling through her phone. My parents were standing together at the counter, both staring at my father's laptop. Hey, I said. We should probably leave soon if we want good seats. Neither of them moved. My mother spoke first. Sweetheart, something came up. I stood there in the kitchen, still holding the folded pages of my graduation speech. What do you mean, something came up? I asked. My father finally looked up from his laptop. Victoria has a networking event today, he said flatly. Goldman Sachs. One of their directors is hosting it. Victoria didn't even bother lifting her eyes from her phone. It's a huge opportunity, my mother added quickly. Like that explained everything. The clock above the stove ticked quietly. My ceremony starts at 2, I said. Yes, my father replied. Another silence. Then the sentence that would stay with me for years. Photography isn't really a career, Myra. He said it calmly. Not cruelly, just certain. Victoria meeting people in finance could open real doors. I remember looking down at my graduation gown, the cap in my hands, the speech I had practiced for weeks in front of the mirror. I'm giving a speech today, I said quietly. Victoria finally looked up then. She gave a small smile, not mean exactly, but the kind that makes it clear she already knows how the conversation will end. You'll do great, she said. Then she went back to her phone. My mother kissed my cheek as she passed me. We'll celebrate later. They left 20 minutes later. The house felt strangely large after the front door closed. I stood alone in the kitchen for a long time before finally picking up my car keys. Anyone who has ever walked into an important moment alone knows the strange mix of emotions that follows you there. Pride, embarrassment, and a quiet determination not to let anyone see the empty seats. If you've ever had to show up somewhere important by yourself, you know that feeling. That day I drove to my graduation alone. The ceremony hall was already filling when I arrived. Families were everywhere, parents taking photos, siblings hugging graduates, flowers and laughter filling the room. I sat in the back row waiting for my name to be called for the speech. When my turn came, I walked up to the podium and looked out at the crowd. Hundreds of faces, and only one person I recognized. Front row, clapping before I even said a word. Grandma Eleanor. She stayed for the entire ceremony. And afterward, when everyone else was taking pictures with their families, she pulled me into a hug and whispered something that wouldn't make sense until years later. The greatest treasures, she said softly, aren't always the ones people fight over. Then she smiled at me. Sometimes they're the ones quietly passed on. At the time, I didn't understand what my grandmother meant. I thought she was just being kind, the way she always was when the rest of the world seemed uninterested in noticing me. But a few weeks later, I packed 2 suitcases and bought a one-way ticket to Los Angeles. No farewell dinner. No emotional goodbye at the airport. My parents barely asked questions. You'll figure things out eventually, my father said when I told him I was moving. Just don't expect us to fund a hobby. Victoria laughed. You'll be back in a year. I didn't argue with either of them. Because the truth was, I didn't know what my life would look like yet either. All I knew was that I needed distance. 3,000 miles felt like a good start. Los Angeles was overwhelming at first. Too big, too loud, too fast. I took the first job anyone would give me, an assistant to a wedding photographer who mostly needed someone to carry equipment and adjust lighting. For the first 6 months, I barely touched a camera. I hauled tripods. I edited photos at 2 in the morning. I learned how chaos moves during weddings, where people stand when they're nervous, where the real emotions happen when the formal moments are over. Little by little, the photographer started trusting me with small things, then bigger ones, then full ceremonies. Years passed that way, quiet work, long hours, client by client, until one day I looked up and realized something surprising. I had built a life, a real one. By the time I turned 28, Everlight Studios, my photography company, had 12 employees and more bookings than we could comfortably handle. Our photos had been featured in magazines. Our weddings were booked nearly 2 years in advance, but my family didn't know any of that, because they had never asked. Victoria still called occasionally, though, not to check on me, mostly to update me on her life. Senior marketing director at 29, she announced during one phone call. Corner office. That's impressive, I said. What about you? She asked. I glanced around my office, the one overlooking downtown Los Angeles, with framed magazine covers on the wall. Oh, I said calmly. I'm doing fine. If you've ever built something quietly while the people who doubted you kept assuming you were still struggling, you know that strange feeling. It's not anger. It's clarity. And that clarity became even sharper the day my phone rang with a Boston number I didn't recognize. The man on the other end introduced himself as Harrison Lawson. Myra, he said gently. I'm calling about your grandmother. I knew something was wrong the moment I heard the pause in his voice. Myra, the man said again, more softly this time. I'm very sorry. Your grandmother passed away last night. For a second, the words didn't make sense. The office around me faded into a quiet blur. The city outside my window kept moving: cars, sunlight, people walking on sidewalks, but everything inside me stopped. Grandma Eleanor had been slowing down for years, but she had always seemed permanent, somehow. Like the one person in my life who would always still be there. "I'll arrange a flight," I heard myself say. "You may want to come to Boston soon," the lawyer replied. "Your grandmother asked that I speak with you personally." I booked the first plane out that afternoon. The funeral was held 3 days later at Trinity Church. Boston in early autumn has a particular kind of quiet beauty. Gold leaves, crisp air, the smell of the harbor drifting through the streets. It almost made the grief feel sharper. The church was full. Hundreds of people had come to say goodbye. Artists, gallery owners, students, philanthropists. My grandmother had spent most of her life supporting young artists, funding exhibitions, quietly paying for scholarships that helped people like me build careers. She believed beauty deserved protection. I sat in the third row by myself. My parents were in the front greeting guests. Victoria stood beside them in a black designer dress, accepting condolences with practiced grace. But I noticed something strange. Between the hugs and quiet conversations, Victoria kept leaning toward my mother and whispering. My mother would whisper back. Then both of them would glance toward my father. It didn't look like grief. It looked like planning. At one point, I heard Victoria say something quietly to my mother. "Have you asked the lawyer about the jewelry yet?" My mother's voice came back sharp. "Not here." They stopped talking when they realized I was close enough to hear. I turned my eyes back toward the casket. Even in that moment, it felt wrong. My grandmother had spent her entire life giving to other people, and already my family was thinking about what she had left behind. After the service ended, guests slowly began leaving the church. I was standing near the back when a man in a gray suit approached me. "Miss Wells?" "Yes." "Harrison Lawson," he said gently. "Your grandmother asked that you stay a moment after everyone leaves. There's something she wanted you to receive privately." My heart tightened. "Now?" He nodded. "Yes." At the time, I thought I was about to receive a small keepsake. Maybe a photograph. Maybe a piece of jewelry she had loved. I had no idea I was about to walk into the moment that would change everything. Because inside the envelope waiting for me was a secret my family would never see coming. The church had emptied by the time Mr. Lawson led me into a small office near the back hallway. The room smelled faintly of old wood and paper. A single lamp glowed on the desk between us. Outside the window, the last of the funeral guests were leaving Trinity Church. Mr. Lawson sat down and placed a large manila envelope on the desk. "Your grandmother came to see me 2 years ago," he said. "She was very clear about what she wanted done." I nodded, still numb from the funeral. "This," he continued, sliding the envelope toward me, "is separate from her public will." My fingers felt strangely cold as I opened it. Inside were 2 legal documents and a handwritten letter. The first document was a notarized amendment to my grandmother's estate. I read the same sentence 3 times before it fully made sense. The Hartwell Jewelry Collection's sole ownership transferred to Myra Eleanor Wells. I blinked. The Hartwell collection was famous in Boston social circles. Antique pearls, Art Deco diamonds, heirloom sapphires, pieces that had been passed down through generations. It had always been assumed Victoria would inherit them. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the letter. The paper was thick cream stationery. I recognized my grandmother's handwriting immediately. "My dearest Myra, if you are reading this, it means I am gone." My throat tightened. I know what your mother and sister will expect. They believe these pieces are trophies, things to display and impress people with. But you understand something they never did. You understand that beauty carries stories. You see history where others see status. I had to pause because my vision was blurring. Across the desk, Mr. Lawson sat quietly, giving me time. The letter continued. "Your sister will be angry when she learns this. Your parents may think I made a mistake. But I have watched you carefully all these years, Myra. You never asked for anything. You simply built your life. These pieces belong with someone who understands how to protect them. They belong with you." By the time I finished reading, tears had begun slipping down my face. Mr. Lawson spoke gently. "There is one more instruction your grandmother left." I looked up. "She asked that the transfer remain confidential for now," he said, "until you decide the right moment to reveal it." I folded the letter slowly. For the first time that day, I felt something other than grief. Clarity. Because I suddenly understood what my grandmother had meant years ago. The greatest treasures aren't always the ones people fight over. Sometimes they're the ones quietly passed on. And 6 months later, I would finally open that envelope again. At my sister's wedding. For 6 months, I told no one. Not my parents. Not Victoria. Not even my closest friends in Los Angeles. The Hartwell jewelry collection remained locked in a private vault at the bank exactly where my grandmother had left it. 12 pieces in total, pearls from the 1920s, diamond earrings from the Art Deco period, a sapphire brooch that once belonged to a European duchess. But the value of the pieces wasn't what mattered most to me. It was the trust. My grandmother had seen something in me that the rest of my family never bothered to notice. And she had made sure that when the time came, the truth would speak for itself. Life went on after the funeral. I flew back to Los Angeles and returned to work. Weddings to photograph, clients to meet, contracts to sign. Everlight Studios had grown into something bigger than I ever imagined when I first arrived in California with 2 suitcases. But back in Boston, another story was quietly unfolding. 3 months after the funeral, Victoria got engaged. Marcus Thornton. Old money from Connecticut. His family owned commercial real estate across most of New England, buildings, hotels, entire city blocks in some places. The engagement photos alone looked like something out of a magazine. Private yacht, champagne, a ring large enough that it practically had its own gravitational pull. The wedding announcement spread quickly through Boston's social circles. 400 guests. The Grand Belmont Hotel ballroom. A 6-figure event planned by one of the most exclusive wedding planners on the East Coast. It was exactly the kind of life my parents had always imagined for Victoria, and exactly the kind of world I had quietly stepped away from. Still, I waited for the invitation, not because I expected warmth, but because it would have been strange not to invite your own sister. Weeks passed. Nothing came in the mail. Nothing appeared in my inbox. At first, I assumed it was a delay. Then one evening, I saw Victoria post something on social media. A photo of the guest list envelopes stacked on a marble table. Invitations officially sent. I stared at the image for a long time. Every name in elegant gold script. 400 guests. And apparently no place for mine. If you've ever watched someone build a world that clearly has no space for you in it, you know how quiet that realization feels. Eventually, I decided to call my mother. "Mom," I said when she answered, "I think my invitation might have gotten lost in the mail." There was a pause, a long one, and in that silence, I already knew the truth was coming. The silence on the phone lasted just a little too long. "Myra," my mother finally said. Her voice had that careful tone people use when they're trying to soften something unpleasant. "Victoria actually asked me to speak with you about the wedding." My fingers tightened around the phone. "Okay," I said. "It's just that the wedding is going to be very intimate." For a second, I thought I had misheard. "Intimate?" I repeated slowly. "Yes," she continued. "Victoria felt it would be better if we kept it small." I turned my laptop slightly so I could see the photo Victoria had posted earlier that day. 400 envelopes. 400 guests. Crystal chandeliers in the Grand Belmont ballroom. "That's strange," I said quietly. "Because the venue holds 400 people." Another silence. Then my mother sighed. "You know how you can be at these events." I waited. A little awkward. The words sat there between us. Heavy. Final. "We don't want anything to distract from Victoria's day," she added. I looked out the window of my office at the Los Angeles skyline glowing in the late afternoon sun. For 28 years, I had tried to earn a place in that family. By being quiet. By not asking for attention. By building my life somewhere else so they wouldn't have to be embarrassed by it. And still, I was the one who didn't belong. "I understand," I said finally. My mother sounded relieved. "I knew you'd see it that way." We ended the call a few seconds later. That night, I scrolled through Victoria's social media again. Dress fittings. Engagement parties. Her bridal registry at Tiffany. Hundreds of comments from people excited to attend the wedding. 400 seats. But not one for her sister. I stared at the screen for a long time before closing the app. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not anger. Not revenge. Just a quiet decision. I wasn't going to argue with them. I wasn't going to beg for a place that had never really been mine. But I was going to Boston. And I was going to bring a gift. If you were in that position, banned from your own sister's wedding while hundreds of strangers were invited, what would you do? Would you show up anyway? Or would you walk away completely? I'm genuinely curious what you would choose. Tell me where you're listening from and what your answer would be. Stories like this always reveal more about people than we expect. I booked the flight 3 days before the wedding. Los Angeles to Boston. Round trip. Not because I planned to stay, but because I didn't want the return ticket to feel like an escape. The silver box sat on my kitchen counter the entire time I packed. Small, polished, barely larger than my hand. Anyone looking at it would assume it held something simple, maybe jewelry, maybe a bracelet, maybe a sentimental keepsake meant to congratulate a bride on her wedding day. No one would guess what was actually inside. I wrapped it carefully with a white ribbon. Then I placed the envelope inside. The envelope that had been sitting in my desk drawer for 6 months. The one containing the documents from my grandmother. And the letter. The night before my flight, I barely slept. Not because I was afraid of seeing my family again. That part didn't scare me anymore. What kept me awake was something else. A question that kept returning over and over. Was I doing this for the right reason? It would have been easy to turn the whole thing into revenge, to show up angry, to expose Victoria out of pure bitterness. But that wasn't what this was. I didn't want to destroy her wedding. I didn't want to humiliate her. All I wanted was to stop carrying a truth that didn't belong only to me. My grandmother had trusted me to reveal it when the time was right. And the strange thing about truth is this: it doesn't shout. It just waits for the moment when silence no longer makes sense. At 6 in the morning, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, adjusting a simple navy dress. No designer label. No dramatic entrance planned. Just something quiet and respectful. I picked up the silver box and held it for a moment. "You can do this," I whispered to my reflection. Then I placed it inside my bag. At the airport, everything felt strangely normal. Travelers rolling suitcases, coffee machines humming, people rushing toward gates with headphones in their ears. No one there knew that in a few hours I would be standing at my sister's wedding, without an invitation. And no one knew that a small silver box in my bag carried the one truth my family had spent years avoiding. If you've stayed with this story this far, stay with us. Strength grows here. Because the moment I walked into the Grand Belmont Hotel later that afternoon, everything that had been hidden in my family for decades was about to surface. And it would begin with one very simple question at the reception desk. "Name, please?" The Grand Belmont Hotel looked exactly the way Victoria would have wanted it to. Everything about it whispered quiet wealth. Crystal chandeliers hung above the marble lobby floor. Massive arrangements of white roses and hydrangeas lined the entrance. A string quartet played softly near the ballroom doors, while guests in tailored suits and silk dresses drifted inside with glasses of champagne. I stood near the entrance for a moment, taking it all in. Not with jealousy, just observation. Photography had trained me to notice details, how people moved in rooms like this, how carefully curated every moment was meant to look. Victoria loved moments like that. She had always loved the appearance of perfection. I smoothed my dress, adjusted the strap of my bag, and walked toward the reception table. 2 women in black dresses sat behind a long table covered with neatly organized guest lists. One of them smiled politely. "Welcome to the Wells Thornton wedding. Name, please?" "Myra Wells," I said. For a second, the woman didn't react. Then she glanced down at the printed pages. Her finger began moving slowly through the list. W. Wells. 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 The smile on her face faded slightly. She turned a page. Then another. The second woman leaned over to help. "Check the family section," she murmured quietly. The first woman scanned it again. I already knew what they were about to say. But there is something strange about hearing a truth spoken out loud, even when you expect it. Finally, the woman looked up. Her voice had changed. "I'm sorry, ma'am." She hesitated. "Your name isn't on the list." I nodded once. "Could you check again?" I asked gently. She did. Slowly this time. The other receptionist joined in, flipping through the remaining pages. "Harold Wells," she read quietly. "Patricia Wells. Victoria Wells. Soon to be Thornton." She looked back at me, but there was no Myra. The ballroom doors behind them were open just enough that I could see the reception beginning. Round tables with ivory linens, tall floral centerpieces reaching toward the chandeliers, guests laughing, servers moving gracefully between them. 400 people celebrating my sister's wedding, and not a single place set for me. The first receptionist looked genuinely uncomfortable now. Is there someone we could call for you? Yes, I said. There is. I stepped away from the table and pulled out my phone. My fingers didn't shake. Not anymore. Victoria answered on the third ring. What? Her voice was sharp, impatient. Behind her, I could hear the music and conversation from the reception already building. It's me, I said. I'm at the hotel. A pause, then a quiet sigh of annoyance. What do you want, Myra? My name isn't on the guest list. There was a moment of silence. Then she laughed. Not kindly. You actually came? I closed my eyes briefly. Yes. Well, she said coolly. That was your first mistake. I flew across the country, I said. Again, she replied. That sounds like a you problem. I could almost picture her standing somewhere in that ballroom, champagne in hand, surrounded by people who believed they knew her. I just wanted to give you a wedding gift, I said. Another small laugh. What could you possibly give me that I don't already have? I looked down at the silver box in my bag. Goodbye, Victoria, I said quietly. And then I hung up. For a few seconds after the call ended, I just stood there in the hotel lobby. The music from the ballroom drifted out through the open doors, violins, soft laughter, the low hum of hundreds of conversations blending together. Inside that room, my family was celebrating. My mother was probably telling Marcus's relatives how perfect Victoria had always been. My father was likely shaking hands with investors and old family friends. Victoria herself would be floating from table to table in a white gown, smiling the polished smile she had spent years perfecting. None of them were thinking about me. That part didn't hurt the way it once would have, because now it simply confirmed something I had understood for a long time. I took a slow breath and walked back toward the gift table. It was enormous. Boxes of every size were stacked in neat towers, Tiffany blue, Hermes, orange, glossy white packages tied with elaborate gold bows, crystal decanters, silver frames, envelopes that almost certainly held checks large enough to make most people dizzy. My small silver box looked almost invisible among them. I placed it carefully near the edge of the table. For a moment, I rested my hand on the lid. Inside were 4 things. The notarized amendment to my grandmother's will, her handwritten letter explaining exactly why she had made that decision, a photograph of the 2 of us standing outside the small Boston jewelry shop she used to love, and one final document, a copy of a contract. Everlight Studios, client, Myra Wells. Service agreement for wedding photography. Amount paid, $15,000 deposit. Owner, Myra Wells. I slid the small card beneath the ribbon. To Victoria. From your sister, Myra. Nothing more. The receptionist who had spoken to me earlier had walked over quietly. She watched as I stepped back from the table. Ma'am, she said softly. Are you sure you don't want me to try calling someone for you? Maybe the wedding planner? I shook my head. No, thank you. She looked uncertain. You're just leaving? Yes. But your sister, she'll see the gift. The woman studied my face, clearly trying to understand why someone who had just been turned away from her own sister's wedding looked so calm. I hope it's something nice, she said gently. I smiled a little. It's something honest. Outside the hotel, the air was cool and sharp with the scent of autumn. Boston evenings always had that crisp clarity to them, the kind that makes the city feel both beautiful and distant at the same time. I called a taxi and slid into the back seat. Logan Airport, I told the driver. As we pulled away from the Grand Belmont, I looked back once. Through the tall windows of the ballroom, I could see the reception fully underway now. A room full of celebration. A perfect wedding, at least for the moment. Because somewhere on that gift table sat a small silver box, and inside that box waited a truth Victoria had spent years building her life without. By the time she opened it, I would already be on my way back to Los Angeles. I leaned my head back against the seat and checked the time on my phone. 7:48 p.m. The reception would move into dinner soon. After that, speeches. Then dessert. And somewhere in between, the bride and groom would walk to the gift table. They would choose a few packages to open in front of their guests. Victoria loved public moments like that. She loved applause, loved attention, loved being admired. The taxi turned onto the highway toward the airport. The city lights of Boston stretched out ahead of us, and somewhere behind me, inside a ballroom filled with 400 people. My sister was about to discover something she had never once imagined. That the quiet sister she had dismissed for most of her life had never actually been the small one. Logan Airport was calm in a way the wedding ballroom behind me would never be. People moved quietly through the terminal, business travelers rolling carry-ons, families corralling sleepy children, the soft echo of announcements drifting across the high ceiling. No one here knew what was happening 10 miles away. No one knew that a silver box had just been placed on a table beneath a chandelier in the Grand Belmont Ballroom. I checked my phone. 8:12 p.m. Right about now, dinner would be finishing. Victoria loved schedules. Her entire wedding had been planned like a production. Cocktail hour at 7, dinner at 8, speeches shortly after. And then the small gift moment she had insisted on adding to the evening. I knew this because of something that had happened 2 months earlier, something that had made the entire situation almost surreal. It had started with a phone call in my office. My assistant Jenna knocked on the door that afternoon. "You have a call," she said. Someone named Caroline Ashford. I nearly dropped the pen I was holding. Caroline Ashford was one of the most respected wedding planners on the East Coast. Her agency coordinated events for politicians, celebrities, old Boston families. She had also been my grandmother Eleanor's closest friend for decades. I picked up the phone. "Myra," she said warmly. "It's been far too long." We spoke for a few minutes about my grandmother, about how much she had loved the work I was doing with Everlight Studios. Then Caroline cleared her throat. "I'm calling because I have a bride who needs a photographer," she said. "That happens occasionally," I replied carefully. "This one is particular." "That also happens occasionally." Caroline chuckled softly. "She wants the best available team," I recommended Everlight. "That's very kind of you." There was a small pause. "Myra," she said, "the bride is your sister." I remember sitting perfectly still. "Victoria?" I asked. "Yes," Caroline continued gently. "She doesn't know you own the company. She simply saw the portfolio we presented and insisted on booking your team." "And you didn't correct her?" "Your grandmother believed truth finds its way out eventually," Caroline said. "I suppose I do too." The contract had already been signed. $15,000 paid as a non-refundable deposit. Everlight Studios would photograph Victoria Wells's wedding, but I wouldn't be there personally. My team handled the event. Professionally. Quietly. Exactly the way we handled every other wedding. Victoria never knew the company she had hired belonged to me. The irony of that fact had stayed with me ever since. But there was something else Caroline told me during that conversation. Something even more revealing. "A few weeks ago," she said carefully, "Victoria hosted a bridal brunch at the Four Seasons. 30 women. Champagne. Perfectly arranged finger sandwiches. And during the afternoon, Victoria had made an announcement. She told the room she would soon inherit the Hartwell jewelry collection. According to her, it had always been understood that the pieces would be hers. She seemed very certain," Caroline said quietly. I had said nothing at the time, just listened. Because by then I had already read my grandmother's letter, and I knew something Victoria didn't. The collection had never belonged to her, not anymore. Back in the airport lounge, I set my phone down on the small table in front of me. The sky outside the glass windows had turned deep blue. Somewhere across the city, dessert would be arriving at the wedding reception. And very soon, someone would reach for a small silver box. At the Grand Belmont Ballroom, everything still looked perfect. Crystal chandeliers glowed above rows of round tables covered in ivory linens. Tall arrangements of white roses and hydrangeas reached toward the ceiling. The orchestra in the corner played softly while servers in white gloves cleared the last of the dinner plates. 400 guests sat comfortably in that room. Boston's social circle. Marcus Thornton's powerful relatives. Victoria's carefully chosen network of impressive friends. From the outside, the evening looked exactly like the wedding Victoria had spent months designing. At the center of it all sat the bride herself, Victoria Wells, now Victoria Thornton, glowing in a custom gown, a glass of champagne in her hand, smiling as guests stopped by the head table to congratulate her. Marcus sat beside her, handsome and attentive. My parents were at the same table, greeting visitors with proud expressions. Everything appeared flawless. During cocktail hour earlier, Victoria had enjoyed telling people about her future inheritance, the Hartwell jewelry collection. $2 million worth of antique pieces passed through generations of Boston society. My grandmother adored me, she had told several guests with a confident laugh. Those jewels will finally have someone who appreciates them. Several women had admired the idea out loud. Imagine wearing those pearls at the Met Gala. Victoria had smiled as if that were already part of her future. None of them knew the truth. Now dessert had arrived. Coffee cups clinked softly against saucers. A few guests were already beginning to stand and stretch. That was when the master of ceremonies stepped forward and tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said warmly, "before we cut the cake tonight, the bride and groom would like to open a few special gifts." The room brightened with polite laughter. Victoria clapped her hands once delighted. "Oh, I love this part," she said. Marcus smiled and stood with her. Together they walked toward the enormous gift table. A camera flash popped as someone captured the moment. Guests turned in their seats to watch. Victoria began opening packages one by one. A crystal vase. A silver tray. A set of engraved champagne flutes. Each gift received a gracious smile and a polite thank you. Then her hand landed on something smaller. A silver box tied with a white ribbon. She glanced at the card. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Well," she said with a short laugh, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, "this is unexpected." Marcus leaned closer. "What is it?" Victoria held up the card. "Apparently my sister sent a gift after all." A few guests exchanged curious looks. "The sister who couldn't make it tonight?" someone asked. Victoria shrugged lightly. "She probably mailed something sentimental." She slipped the ribbon loose and lifted the lid. Inside was a thick envelope. The smile on her face flickered. She pulled out the first document and unfolded it slowly. At first, nothing changed. Then her eyes moved across the page, and the color drained from her face. For a moment, Victoria didn't move. The ballroom noise continued around her soft conversation. Silverware clinking against plates, the quiet murmur of 400 guests finishing dessert. But near the gift table, a small circle of people had already gone silent. Marcus noticed first. "What is it?" he asked, leaning slightly closer. Victoria didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the paper in her hands. The smile she had been wearing moments ago faded slowly, like someone dimming a light. She looked back down at the document again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less disturbing if she stared long enough. Then she flipped to the second page. "Victoria?" Marcus said again. Her fingers trembled slightly now. "What is it?" my mother asked from a few steps away. Victoria finally inhaled sharply. "This," she whispered. Her voice sounded thin. "This isn't real." The first document slipped slightly in her hands. Marcus reached out and took it from her, scanning the page quickly. It was a legal amendment. Stamped. Notarized. Signed. At the top of the page, the title was clear. Estate Amendment. Hartwell Collection. Marcus frowned. "This says the jewelry collection was transferred." He stopped mid-sentence. My mother stepped forward. "Transferred to who?" she asked. Marcus looked up slowly. "To Myra." The silence that followed was immediate. Not loud, just heavy. Victoria's breathing had changed. "That's impossible," she said. Her voice was louder now. "That's completely impossible." She grabbed the paper back and began scanning it again. The Hartwell Jewelry Collection. Sole ownership, Myra Eleanor Wells. Her hands were shaking harder now. "This is fake," she said quickly. "It has to be fake." Guests at the nearest tables had begun to notice. The room's attention was shifting toward the gift table. My father stepped forward, his face tight. "Let me see that." Victoria handed him the document. He studied it carefully, longer than Marcus had, long enough that my mother's voice grew uneasy. "Harold?" she asked quietly. But my father didn't answer right away, because he recognized the signature at the bottom of the page, his mother's. Victoria had already grabbed the second piece of paper from the envelope, the handwritten letter. She unfolded it quickly, her eyes racing across the page. Halfway through, her face changed again. Confusion, then something sharper. "No," she whispered. She looked up at my mother. "This says she chose Myra." Her voice cracked. "She says I see the jewelry as trophies." A few guests closer to the table had now turned fully toward the scene. Victoria's breath came faster. "This is ridiculous," she snapped suddenly. She barely knew Myra. She lifted the letter like proof of a crime. "This is manipulation. Myra must have convinced her to sign this." Marcus didn't speak. He was looking down into the open silver box. "There's something else in here," he said quietly. Victoria glanced down. At the bottom of the box sat one final folded sheet of paper. She picked it up, unfolded it, and froze again. Because across the top of the page was a company name she had seen many times over the past 6 months. Everlight Studios wedding photography agreement. Her eyes dropped to the signature line. Owner and proprietor, Myra Wells. For a long moment, Victoria simply stared at the contract. The room around her had grown quiet enough that even the orchestra had slowed to a hesitant stop. Conversations at nearby tables faded as people realized something unusual was happening at the gift table. Marcus leaned closer. "What does it say?" Victoria didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the bottom of the page. Owner and proprietor, Myra Wells. The words didn't move. They didn't soften. They simply existed. Marcus reached for the paper and gently took it from her hands. He read it carefully. Once, then again. "You hired her company," he said slowly. Victoria shook her head immediately. "No, that's not possible." "The contract is signed," Marcus replied. Victoria's voice rose slightly, sharp with panic. "I didn't hire Myra. I hired Everlight Studios." Marcus looked up. "That is Everlight Studios." The silence spread further through the room. At a nearby table, someone whispered, "Isn't that the photography team working tonight?" Several guests turned their heads toward the corner of the ballroom, where the photographers had been quietly documenting the reception all evening. One of them, a young woman holding a camera, shifted uncomfortably as the attention landed on her. Victoria turned sharply. "You," she said, pointing. The photographer froze. "Yes, ma'am? Who do you work for?" "Everlight Studios." Victoria's breathing was uneven now. "And who owns that company?" The photographer hesitated, then answered honestly, "Myra Wells." A ripple moved across the ballroom. Marcus looked down at the contract again. "It says here your deposit was $15,000, he said. Victoria's hands went to her temples. No, that's not right." Marcus's voice had grown colder. "You told me your sister struggled. You said she couldn't keep a job." Victoria turned toward him desperately. "That's what I thought." The photographer spoke again, gently. "Everlight Studios is actually one of the most sought-after wedding photography firms in the country." Someone at a nearby table leaned forward. "Wait, Everlight?" Another guest nodded slowly. "They shot the Whitmore wedding last year." A woman across the room added quietly, "And the Reynolds Gala." Recognition began spreading. Marcus looked at Victoria again. "How long have you known this?" "I didn't," she insisted. Her voice cracked. "I didn't know." But the damage was already unfolding. Because the documents in her hands had just revealed 3 truths at once. The jewelry she had promised everyone belonged to Myra. The photography team she had proudly hired worked for Myra. And the sister she had spent years dismissing was no longer the person she thought she was. Marcus looked down into the silver box again, then back at Victoria. His expression had changed. "Victoria," he said quietly, "what else have you been wrong about?" Victoria opened her mouth, but nothing came out. For the first time in her life, the room wasn't waiting for her to speak, it was watching her try to recover. The silence in the ballroom had become unmistakable now. Conversations had stopped at nearby tables. A few guests farther away were leaning forward, trying to understand what had just happened. Marcus still held the contract in his hands. "Victoria," he said again, more firmly this time, "did you know about this?" "I told you I didn't," she snapped, her voice shaking. But the confidence that had carried her through the evening was gone. Marcus turned the paper so she could see it again. "Then explain this," he said. She looked down at the signature line again. Owner and proprietor, Myra Wells. Her sister's name, printed clearly, unmistakably. Across the ballroom, someone quietly pulled out their phone. Another guest whispered something to the person beside them. The whispers began spreading like small waves. My father was still standing beside the gift table, the estate document clutched tightly in his hand. His eyes had not left the signature at the bottom of the page. He knew his mother's handwriting. He knew the way she signed her name. And he knew this document wasn't fake. My mother stepped closer to him. "Harold," she whispered, her voice tight, "tell me this isn't real." But he didn't answer. Because he had already realized something uncomfortable. For years they had dismissed one daughter while building their hopes around the other. And now, in front of 400 witnesses, the truth was rearranging everything they thought they understood about both of them. Victoria suddenly grabbed her phone from the table. "I'm calling her," she said. Marcus didn't stop her. In fact, he stepped back slightly, watching. The screen lit up with my name. Myra. She pressed the call button. Across the city, inside the quiet airport lounge at Logan, my phone began vibrating on the table in front of me. I watched it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. Victoria ended the call and immediately dialed again. Back in the ballroom, her voice had begun to rise. "Pick up," she muttered under her breath. Guests nearby were now openly staring. Marcus folded his arms. "Why are you calling her?" he asked calmly. Victoria turned toward him, eyes wide. "Because she set this up," she said. Marcus didn't react. "You mean she gave you a gift?" he replied quietly. Victoria didn't answer. Because the difference between those two things was suddenly impossible to ignore. In the airport lounge, my phone rang again. Then again. Then again. 5 missed calls. 7. 10. By the time my flight began boarding, the number had reached 23. I finished my coffee slowly and slid the phone into my bag. Across Boston, inside a ballroom full of people who were no longer celebrating, my sister was still standing beside that open silver box. And for the first time in her life, Victoria Wells was the one no longer in control of the story. When the plane finally lifted off from Logan Airport, the lights of Boston slowly faded beneath the clouds. I watched them disappear through the small oval window beside me. Somewhere down there, the Grand Belmont Ballroom was still full of people trying to understand what had just happened. Victoria was likely still holding her phone. My parents were probably answering difficult questions from Marcus's family, and the silver box was still sitting on that table. Open. Empty. Its purpose fulfilled. I didn't feel triumph. That surprised me. For years, I had imagined what it might feel like if the truth about my life ever reached my family. But now that it had, the feeling wasn't victory. It was quiet, almost peaceful, because I hadn't yelled. I hadn't exposed anyone publicly. I had simply stopped protecting a lie. The flight attendant dimmed the cabin lights as we crossed into the night sky. Passengers around me adjusted blankets and headphones. Life continued normally for everyone on that plane. But for the first time in 28 years, something inside me had changed. I wasn't trying to prove my place in that family anymore. The next morning, Los Angeles looked exactly the same as it always did. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of my office at Everlight Studios. Traffic moved steadily along the streets below. My team had already started setting up for the day's meetings. Nothing about the city had changed, but something inside me had. For 28 years, I had quietly tried to earn a place in a family that never really saw me. I had worked harder, stayed quieter, and told myself that someday they might finally understand who I was. Last night changed that. Not because my sister was embarrassed. Not because 400 people witnessed the truth. But because I finally stopped asking for permission to exist in my own story. The Hartwell jewelry collection now sat safely in a private vault, exactly where my grandmother had wanted it. And for the first time, I understood what she meant all those years ago. Some treasures aren't about possession. They're about knowing your worth. I didn't destroy my sister's wedding. I simply delivered the truth she had spent years ignoring. And sometimes, truth arrives in a small silver box. If this story stayed with you, stand where dignity stands. And tell me one thing: where in the world are you listening from tonight?